Today we're going to talk about a very simple way to nail down the right method of murder for your mystery novel. We're going to talk about the one thing that will always determine the right method for your villain. We'll talk about how things are a little different for premeditated and unpremeditated murder, and we'll talk about a concept that has revolutionized the way I'm thinking about mystery plots, and that is the villain's narrative. Hi, I'm Jane, and I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to Ananya for suggesting the idea for this video in a comment. She asked for information on selecting the method of murder, and I thought, yeah, that's a great idea, something I really need to do. And as I began putting some thoughts together for it, I started having all of these insights, which both expanded the way that I think about mystery plots, but also oddly simplified it as well, made everything very logical and clear. And if there is one thing I like, it is a logical methodology for writing fiction. So Ananya, thank you so much, and let's have some fun. The first thing that we need to wrap our heads around when it comes to method is to remember that the method of murder will always serve the villain's needs. So makes sense, right? You want a nice, juicy murder for your book, but all your villain wants is just to commit a terrible crime and get away with it. To figure out the perfect method of murder for your book, all we have to do is take stock of the villain's interests and concerns, then decide which method best addresses them. To do this, the very first question we're going to ask ourselves is, do we want to write a villain who's planning a narrative murder? And by narrative murder, I mean, is this a murder where the villain is trying to present the police with a complete narrative, describing how this death occurred? We've all seen a mystery where a car's brake lines are cut, resulting in a crash, and that's a narrative murder. The narrative the villain has created is, this death is the result of a car accident. A lot of mysteries involve narrative murders. Among the narratives your villain might attempt to construct are, the death was the result of an accident, like a car accident or a fall. The death was the result of a heart attack or other natural medical event. The death was the result of a robbery that turned deadly. All of these narratives serve the same purpose. They exonerate the villain and ideally keep the police from even looking at him. In the case of a narrative murder, the method of murder will be determined by the intended narrative. If the villain is trying to make this death look like a car accident, his method might be cutting the victim's brake lines. If he's trying to make it look like a heart attack, poison is probably his best bet, and if he's trying to make it look like a robbery, well, he'll use a gun or a knife, and he'll also remove the victim's valuables. In a narrative murder, often one of the very first clues our sleuth is going to get is something that just doesn't jibe with the narrative.
For one thing, I checked the murder scene. Hastings would have had to have been a contortionist to accidentally hit his head and drown.
Then it is murder.
And sometimes a clue that absolutely destroys the narrative can be the final clue that clinches the case and makes it clear exactly what must have happened.
Look at the bite marks. A woman was attacked by a dog.
Oh.
Look at the bite marks.
No,
they're
thank you.
They're all upside down.
This is the final clue that lets the detectives in this case figure out the killer's method of murder. This nasty-looking job made from a cast of dog's teeth. This is a wonderfully original method of murder, and as a mystery writer, it almost feels intimidating. I mean, could I ever come up with something that weird, that clever, that creative? Well, I honestly think I could, if I did it the way I'll bet these writers did. And that's start by coming up with the narrative I wanted my villain to create, in this case, that his wife was mauled by a dog, and then work backward to find the weapon that would best fit that narrative. Frame jobs are also narrative murders. In this case, the narrative is, this death was caused by murder committed by a particular character. In a frame job, the villain will use a method that makes it very obvious that this death happened by murder, and he'll also place other clues to incriminate his patsy. He may transfer fingerprints to new locations. He may plant clues in the patsy's room. He may even steal one of her possessions and use it as the murder weapon to create that all-important narrative. If you're enjoying this video, please consider giving me a thumbs up. That will help this video go out to more people, and that's something I'd truly appreciate. Okay, so what about non-narrative murders, plots in which our villain didn't try to sell the police a particular story? Well, there are two kinds of these, premeditated and unpremeditated, and they're going to play out a little differently, so we're going to handle them separately. But in either case, our guiding principle is going to remain the same. The method of murder will always be determined by the villain's needs. In the case of an unpremeditated murder, our villain is likely to use whatever is close to hand. So that might be a typical weapon like a knife or a blunt object, but it might be something highly atypical, something that he used simply because it was available. In an episode of Monk called Mr. Monk and Lotto Fever, the villain tries to create the narrative of a robbery gone bad, but the detectives dismiss that narrative as soon as they figure out the impromptu nature of his weapon, a pair of scissors.
Who brings scissors to a mugging? Scissors say what?
Spur of the moment, not planned.
At some point, your villain's narrative is going to dissolve. You might choose to create a plot like the Lotto Fever plot, where the villain tries to create a narrative, but the facts speak much more loudly right from the start and the narrative quickly fails. Or you may choose to write a plot where the narrative is painstakingly crafted and holds true almost to the end. Now, you might be writing a book in which the killer plans his crime ahead of time, but doesn't construct a narrative. Maybe he simply didn't think of it, or maybe he wants to send a message to someone through this death, so he doesn't mind people knowing it's murder. Maybe he only had a limited window of time to get close to the villain, to the victim, so creating a narrative wasn't an option. In this case, the method of murder is still going to be determined by his needs. He'll use whatever weapon he thinks gives him the best advantage in this circumstance. So maybe he wants a ranged weapon so he can attack from safety. Maybe he wants to use a bloodless method so that he can avoid getting evidence on his clothes. If you're having trouble thinking of a method that excites you, start by creating a list of the villain's concerns at the time of the murder. And if you're still not getting there, it may be worth piling some extra concerns onto him. What if he had to attack during a crowded party? What if the victim was always surrounded by bodyguards? What method would he use to do the deed in these circumstances? Creating a really difficult situation for your killer can be your ticket to finding an ingenious method. Conversely, if there's a method that you're dying to write, well, ask yourself what narrative that method would serve, or what restrictions might make that method a logical choice for your villain. What might force him into choosing that method of murder? The narrative is only one tool our villain has in creating his cover-up, that is, his plan for getting away with murder. Whether he has a narrative or not, he'll definitely have a cover-up, which could involve destroying evidence, hiding the body, paying off witnesses, or it may even involve creating a narrative about himself, that is, creating an alibi to explain where he was when the crime occurred. If the murder was premeditated, he'll likely have put his cover-up together ahead of time, but if it was unpremeditated, let's say he was surprised while committing a criminal act and killed the witness who surprised him, he is going to have to put that cover-up together on the fly. Either way, as your sleuth begins to put together the facts of the case, your villain will likely have to make adjustments to his cover-up, committing subsequent crimes to cover his tracks. This will often give him the opportunity to make some big mistakes, which is more than likely how he'll get caught.